Hello, I'm Emily Golson, and this is my presentation on why I think it is not a good idea to return to the Fairness Doctrine, and this is mostly because it has many flaws and it is not really applicable to the reasons that citizens today are wanting it for. So a recent example that you may have probably heard of, there was a hearing by the House Judiciary Committee in 2020 that featured the CEOs of Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Google, which handled the Fairness Doctrine debate. And a Columbia Journalism Review called it the social media version of the debate, which is now dominating journalism, centering on objectivity and whether reports have an obligation to surface opposing views, even if they are false or objectionable. So what is the Fairness Doctrine really? It's enforced by the Federal Communications Council, and it was rooted in the media world of 1949. And Congress backed the policy in 1954, and then fast forward to the 1970s, the FCC called the doctrine the single most important requirement of operation in the public interest. So according to the Washington Post, the doctrine mandated that broadcasters cover issues of public importance in ways that presented opposing perspectives, operating under a view of free speech that privileged an audience's rights to diverse voices and views over broadcasters' narrower First Amendment protections. So it's really important to remember that the doctrine applied really only exclusively to radio and television broadcasters. Other arguments that the Fairness Doctrine should also apply to newspapers or publications were rejected by the Supreme Court as a violation of the publisher's First Amendment rights. So the reason that the Supreme Court considered the Fairness Doctrine constitutional in the broadcast context, but not in the other context of media, really has to do with the fact that broadcasters are what are called licensees of a scarce public resource, or otherwise known as the broadcast spectrum. So broadcasters' privileged access to this public resource essentially means that they are called public trustees, who must abide by some public interest obligations. These public interest obligations have, in addition to Fairness Doctrine, included requirements such as providing minimum levels of educational children's programming and providing equal time to political candidates. And this is from the Columbia Journalism Review. And the political power that was wielded over these core media infrastructures by large commercial firms, in quote, threatened democratic society by potentially skewing the nation's discourse. And as now, a handful of corporations dominated the entire media system. And so lawmakers were really overall concerned that the monopoly audience control of three major commercial firms, for example, NBC, ABC, and CBS, could misuse their broadcast licenses to get a biased public agenda or set a biased public agenda. So advocates for the policy's return view it as a solution to problems in our current media environment, and specifically to mitigate disinformation in partisan media outlets, and restoring the original rule, especially with its narrow application to just broadcast stations. This would not achieve this goal, and I absolutely agree. So really, this new interest in the Fairness Doctrine came from what is called a form of nostalgia for an era in the U.S. media regulation in which public interest guided policy decisions. And this overlooks really the actual role of public interest in U.S. broadcast regulation over the first 75 years of history. And this is from a media enterprise website called Zocalo. And the public interest was historically buffeted by, in quote, business, political, and technological forces. The Fairness Doctrine itself was unevenly enforced, its applicability was unclear, and its effectiveness was uncertain. Its promise was always far greater than its performance. So, really today, the doctrine is even less plausible as a ready-made solution for solving modern problems, and as stated earlier, it only pertained to broadcast media, so extending it to things like cable outlets would pretty much require an entirely new framework, and it's really kind of incomprehensible to just strictly apply it to social media platforms for different practical and legal reasons. So the Columbia Journalism Review says that the mechanics of applying the fairness doctrine to newscasts are very different from applying them to social media platforms with billions of users. Everyone's newsfeed is essentially its own newscast with the platform's curation algorithms, and in some cases actual humans making decisions about what does and what does not show up in your feed and in what order. So the differences in scale and scope for implementing a fairness doctrine for social media platforms are very monumental. And it's also worth understanding that the FCC decided to eliminate the fairness doctrine in 1987. This was because the FCC argued that the doctrine was really no longer necessary given the growth in the media outlets that were available. This was just in 1987. And an argument that echoes today, really, in today's time. We still hear a lot about it today. So this growth facilitated access to a diversity of perspectives in a less heavy-handed way than the fairness doctrine. So the FCC argued that the doctrine really had unintended and counterproductive consequences, and the commission relied on, in quote, testimonials from broadcasters who stated that the doctrine had a chilling effect on their speech, compelling them to avoid coverage of controversial issues rather than endure the process of responding to the fairness doctrine complaints that such coverage generated. So really, to conclude, social media platforms are not what the Columbia Journalism Review calls passive bulletin boards that the executive order demands them to be, and nor should they be at all. And for this reason, more than any other, borrowing an outdated principle developed in 1949 can be very, very dangerous for today. And recent events should really cause us to re-examine our assumptions about the relationships between the First Amendment, content regulation, corporate power, and any hope for a democratic future. And this is from the Washington Post. And revisiting historical debates about the fairness doctrine can really help us think through these very difficult issues.